Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today.
Welcome back to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Today we have two guests with us today where we can talk about late season corn and soybean diseases. Our first guest is Dr. Pierce Paul. He is our corn and small grains pathologist and extension specialist. Welcome, Pierce.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Pierce, when we're looking at corn diseases, late season diseases, what's our first step to identifying those diseases, taking some scouting measures? When do you recommend starting that?
Right, so our major leaf disease problems typically kick in at about late vegetative growth stages and early reproductive growth stages. And that's exactly when you really want to plan your fungicide programs to prevent those leaves from becoming damaged at tasseling, pollination, and early grain fill. So I would say, you should start scouting for diseases at around V15, V18 into tasseling, because that's when you're going to have to make your fungicide application decisions.
So what are the recommendations then on how to actually scout for the?
Right.
You want to focus on a couple of the main diseases we have.
Right. Our primary diseases in the state would be gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight. We do see eye spot, we do see rust from time to time, but our main diseases and the major targets for fungicide programs would be gray leaf spot and northern corn leaf blight. And those diseases are both residue-borne diseases, and they typically come from bottom up, especially gray leaf spot. They develop from the lower leaves and move up the plant. So I would recommend, if you're scouting for gray leaf spot, you walk fields and look on that second leaf below the ear leaf to get an idea of whether or not the disease is present and at what level. So you want to, I say, walk random. Look at random plants throughout the field, and then look at that second leaf below the ear to get a sense for if there is gray leaf spot and at what level.
That's great advice. So say I'm walking through the field and I'm seeing that there is some disease present. What things should I be taking into account when I'm considering making a fungicide treatment?
Right. So obviously you can have several different things on a leaf at the same time. So if you're going to focus on gray leaf spot, you want to look for those rectangular lesions on the leaf. Those are lesions that are grayish in color, and they're limited by the veins of the leaf. They can start as small lesions with chlorotic edges or yellowish edges, and then they take on their typical rectangular shape. So that would be classic gray leaf spot. If you're looking for northern corn leaf blight, you're looking for water-soaked lesions that kind of start as cigar-shaped, small but cigar-shaped lesions, and then they expand and become necrotic or darkish, killing parts of the leaf tissue. So you want to make sure you're looking for the right disease to start with. And then the next question you should ask yourself is, how much disease do I have? And the idea here, the rough guide is to look for, disease on that third leaf below the ear on 50% of the plants. So you walk the field, look at multiple plants, and if you see the disease you're concerned about on the third leaf below the ear, well, I'd say the second leaf below the ear. The second leaf below the ear on 50% of the plants, 5 out of 10 plants, you probably should look at more than 10 plants, 50 out of 100 plants, then you're probably at threshold. But I guess the first thing you should really ask yourself is if the hybrid you're looking at is resistant or susceptible to disease in question. So if you've got a hybrid and you know it's susceptible to gray leaf spot, then that should be a focus. If you know it's susceptible to northern corn leaf blight, then that should be a focus. So the first question is my hybrid susceptible? Typically, if the hybrid is resistant and gray leaf spot is the major disease you're seeing in your field, then a fungicide application is generally not warranted. So those are the key things you look at. Know which disease you've got, how much, but most importantly, know if the hybrid you're working with is susceptible to that disease, and then you make a call based on that.
Okay, and about how much time do we have between when we see that threshold and when we need to make the application?
That's a very good question. That's a question that's heavily dependent, one, on the hybrid susceptibility, and two, on the weather conditions. If the hybrid is susceptible, then that disease is likely going to move fast. And if the environmental conditions are favorable, combining favorable environment with a susceptible hybrid, disease is going to move fast. So in about 7 days, you're going to have new lesions develop, new spores being produced, and those are going to spread to new leaves and cause that disease to progress up the plant quickly. So again, it depends on the hybrid susceptibility, depends on the weather. So you want to look, again, ask questions about the hybrid reaction, look at the environmental conditions, look at the forecast. If you see there's wet, humid conditions in the forecast, mornings with those hanging dew, you definitely want to consider using a fungicide, because within 7 days or so, you're going to have more lesions develop and that disease progress up the plant.
You mentioned the thresholds. Could you go into some more detail about how much disease needs to be present for an application to be economical?
Right. So we're still doing a lot of research to answer those questions, because it varies from hybrid to hybrid. And most importantly, it varies with environmental conditions. Even if the hybrid is susceptible and if conditions are not favorable for disease spread, then you're going to see lesions on that leaf, but it's not going to expand. That's one way of disease increasing, lesions expanding. Or new spores are not going to be produced and spread to new leaves. That's the second way disease increases. So it all depends. Now, like I said, we use lesions on the second leaf below the ear as a guide to decide when to apply a fungicide or whether or not a fungicide should be applied. But it could, we need more quantitative estimates of not just lesions, but what percentage of the leaf area is damaged. Again, from some of the work we've done, we see about 5% disease is often associated with response to fungicide application. So I would use that as my guide at this point. You really want to prevent that disease, though, from reaching the ear leaf and the leaves above the ear leaf. So you want to, again, monitor disease on that second and third leaf below the ear, monitor those leaves, and use that as a guide to prevent disease from spreading to the ear leaf. We found that if the ear leaf has about 5% disease, by the time you get to maturity, we found association between 5% disease and yield reduction or yield response to fungicide.
So Pierce, you mentioned that around 5% we can start to see economic loss. What are the consequences of not managing these diseases?
Right. So if your hybrid is susceptible and you don't apply a fungicide in a timely manner and the environment is favorable, you can obviously see a reduction in grain yield, and reduction in grain yield could come in multiple ways. You've got, if the disease comes in late, you're going to have a reduction in the size of the kernels on the ear, and you've got a reduction in size of the ear. So those are the main yield components affected by diseases coming in after tasseling. An indirect consequence of not controlling leaf diseases is reduction in stalk strength. Obviously, that depends on the hybrid. If you've got hybrids with good rind strength, even though it might be susceptible to disease, it can stand up after can tolerate some level of disease without suffering lodging. But if the hybrid is susceptible and doesn't have the greatest rind strength, then you can have lodging as well. You can have damage to the pith, the internal pith of the stems, and that could cause lodging, especially if you've got a windstorm or you've got something preventing harvest from taking place early. So those are some of the direct and indirect consequences of not getting diseases managed. So again, if your hybrid is susceptible, conditions are favorable, you definitely want to put on a fungicide, reduce reduction in grain yield itself, and then minimize those indirect losses associated with lodging.
Excellent. Here's another late season issue that is going to affect yield and even grain quality are ear rots. What are some things that we should be looking for, and when should we start looking for them?
Right. So even, before you get to late season potential ear rot problems, some of those lodging situations I talked about with poorly managed leaf diseases can cause lodging, and lodging can cause ear to come into contact with the ground. And that could be a source of ear rot problems as well. Even though that's not the primary source of air rot problems, you can still have air rot problems associated with lodging. As we get towards the end of the season, actually even before we get towards the end of the season, wet conditions during pollination can favor air rot, the infection of the ears with air rot fungi. The problem is you don't know that you have an air rot problem until you get to the end of the season. And when you get to the end of the season, as you approach the end of the season, then you want to walk fields, especially those fields that are no-tilled. Those are generally the fields that are most likely to have problems with air rots. You want to walk some of those fields and look at plants in those along the rows to see exactly if you've got reason to think you have air rot problems. And the best way to look without even damaging the plants or removing the ears is to look at that ear leaf. If you've got air rot problems and the problem is fairly severe, then you're going to see green plants standing in your field with the air leaf dying or the air leaf dead. That's the first sign of potential air rot problems. You want to walk up to those ears and to those plants and peel back the husk, and you're probably going to see if you've got an air rot problem. So the first telltale sign is walk rows, random plants. They don't occur in groups like you would see with leaf diseases. You would see random plants in the field, and the air leaf is going to be dying or it's going to be dead, and the whole plant is still going to be green. And when you peel them back, you're going to see air rots. Now, the big thing about air rot is getting a sense for which air rot you've got, because air rots are associated with mycotoxins, but not all air rots are associated with mycotoxins. So the next key step, if you see air rot, get a sense for how many plants out of 100 that you walk in the field are showing symptoms of air rot, and then knowing which air rot you've got.
Are there ear rots that are more detrimental to grain quality than others? Those that produce vomitoxins?
Right, definitely. The air rots of biggest concern in terms of grain quality would be those associated with mycotoxin production. And the biggest one in this part of the country would be gibberella air rot. You've got Fusarium air rot as well. You've got Diplodia air rot. And while those are a concern, the one we are most concerned about is gibberella air rot. That produces pinkish white mycelial growth starting at the tip of the ear, and it can move down. And severe air rot is associated with the production of dioxinivalinol, commonly referred to as vomitoxin. And that's a concern because, it's a concern in ethanol production. And if the grain is going to be used for ethanol production, then the level of vomitoxin or dioxinivalinol increases threefold in the DDGs coming out of the ethanol production. And that's not good because those DDGs are destined for consumption by animals. So that would be my biggest concern with air rots. And if you really want to focus on one air rot, then focus on gibberella air rot, and to see exactly if you've got that problem, to know if you need to send grain samples for testing for mycotoxins or be concerned about potential problems later on.
But as far as yield loss, they can all be just as detrimental.
Yeah, severe air rots can actually cause yield loss as well. We're not often very focused on the yield loss aspects of air rots, but they do cause yield reduction. And if you've got a hybrid that's susceptible, and unfortunately we typically don't know how susceptible the hybrids we plant are to air rots, but if you've got a hybrid that's susceptible and conditions are favorable, that would be cool, wet conditions during a couple of weeks after silking, and even wet conditions during harvest, then you can actually see a reduction in yield. Obviously, depending on when the disease comes in, different yield component is going to be affected. If it comes in early enough, then it can reduce the size of the ear as well and the size of the kernels on the ear. Because remember, that fungus enters via the silk channel, and if it enters via the silk channel early enough, then grain development is going to be affected. So it does affect yield reduction, both not only gibberella air rot, but also Diplodia air rot and Fusarium air rot as well.
If we're finding symptoms of ear rots in the field, are there any actions that we can take to slow the progression or lessen the yield impact?
Right. Typically, with air rats, you see symptoms so late that there's very little you can do. A lot of times, fungicides would be off label because it's too late. Pre-harvest interval would have passed. But even if the pre-harvest intervals had not passed, we don't see very consistent results with fungicides for air rat control. We're still running some of those experiments. We're still testing some of those fungicides to see exactly if we can reproduce some of the results we see with scab control in wheat, for example, in terms of air rat control in corn. But unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do to prevent damage, that minimize damage at the field level. But what you can do is plan harvesting strategy and grain handling strategy to minimize air rat development or air rat increase and mycotoxin increase in storage. Those would be try to harvest those affected fields first. So it's a value to know exactly what you've got and how much, and harvest those affected fields first. Even if you have to harvest at a slightly higher moisture content, you want to do that. Then dry down the grain to about 13 to 15% moisture to prevent mycotoxin spread in storage. And most importantly, get a sample tested so at least you know what levels of mycotoxin you're working with. So those are mostly post-harvest or grain handling strategies, but there's very little you can do once you observe an air rat problem in the state, in your field.
So you've got some monitoring stations set up around the state this year. Do you want to talk a little bit about what information you're collecting there related to ear rots?
Right. So we've had questions from stakeholders as to whether we can use our scab forecasting system to predict Gibberella air rat. So what we're doing is collecting information this year from 19 locations across the state, the 10 locations of the corn performance trial, and then we are working with farmers and extension educators to collect data from 9 additional locations across the state. And basically, we are monitoring environmental conditions and monitoring the development of Gibberella air rat specifically. But if we find Fusarium air rat and diploida air rat, we're collecting that information as well. So one of the things we're doing is looking at hybrid reaction from some of the hybrids in the performance trial to see exactly if we can identify those hybrids that are most susceptible to air rats. And we're looking at weather conditions associated with Gibberella air rat. So once we collect that information, we're going to summarize rainfall patterns and temperature patterns and relative humidity patterns and see how that's associated with whether or not Gibberella air rat develops and how much. And that information can ultimately be used to develop risk assessment models moving forward.
So speaking of the scab forecasting, we're into wheat harvest now. What did you see, if anything, with wheat diseases this year, and how is that scab forecasting system working?
You know, the scab forecasting system continues to do well. It's a system that helps us to assess the risk of scab early enough to make a fungicide application. That's part of the reason we're gonna look at trying to develop a similar system for Gibberella air rat and corn. You know, for most of the season, the eastern half of the state was considered to be at moderate to high risk for scab, but the eastern half of the state is not where most of our wheat is. And based on the reports coming in so far, we're still probably a little too early. As guys harvest grain, we're gonna know more. But the levels of scab in the western half of the state, I think it's been low to moderate. So that's consistent with what the forecasting system showed this year.
Pierce, you've shared a lot of great information with us today. Do you have any resources that our listeners can go to if they'd like to find out more?
So the primary source of information, at least most up-to-date information to address issues that you're seeing in your field at a specific time in the season, would be our corn newsletter. So it's corn.osu.edu. You can find updates from myself and Dr. Dorrance on pathology-related issues, and updates from other agronomists and other specialists on other issues facing the crop. We've got our field crops disease website as well, where you can find additional information that are specific to diseases, and our fact sheets are also online where you can find more information. But you know, you've got my email, paul.661. If you got a question, you can shoot me an email. You can send images as well. And you can call me on my cell phone or my office phone if you got additional questions.
Great, and we can put your email address in our description of this episode.
Yep, sounds good to me.
All right, well, thank you so much for your time today.
Our next guest today is Dr. Anne Dorrance. She is the soybean research and extension pathologist in the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences at Ohio State. Welcome, Anne.
Oh, hello.
So to start off with, could you give us an idea of what sort of things you're seeing in the field this season?
So this season has been a little rough. A lot of farmers got in later than the normal calendar date than they did, and then they made up for lost time. So in our fields with these big intermittent storms, they're either no rain or buckets of rain with these are record-setting rains where we're getting 2 to 5 inches within a single rain event. So with that, we are seeing seedling diseases. So especially on untreated seed that had no fungicide or anything for the water molds, we're seeing a lot of scatter damping off. So farmers do need to go and check their stands, make sure that they've got, based on our agronomist Dr. Lindsay, that they do have a minimum of 100,000 to get them through to the whole rest of the year. So now is the time that some last minute replant decisions are being made before we get too late.
Excellent. It is definitely important to make sure there's enough beans out there to get to the end of the season. You noted that we've had a lot of variability in our weather conditions. Across a lot of the state, it has been hotter and wetter than average. So what sorts of diseases should we be concerned with?
So in addition to the seedling diseases, we've got the water molds and some of the ones that are caused by the fungi Rhizoctonium. We've seen a spike in charcoal rot in the last few years, especially when we go through these long dry spells. So charcoal rot has been typically thought of as a southern disease, but some recent data from one of our recent graduates, PhD students, we actually found charcoal rot really throughout the state. So what'll happen is when we hit a really dry spell and we're overplanted, we could see early maturing much more, about 2 to 3 weeks earlier than normal. So it's just something when we get to the late in the season, if the weather continues to be stressful, we'll see more diseases down the road. Another disease that we could see that infections are occurring now, but we won't see the symptoms of till later in the season, is sudden death syndrome. Sudden death syndrome is an interesting pathogen in that the infections actually occur in the seedling stage. The fungus only colonizes the crown and the roots. It's just a root rotter. And then it forms a toxin though. And that toxin at the end of the season, just after the pods have filled and the plant begins to mature and fill the seed, you'll see these beautiful is not the right word. You see this really bright yellow brown necrosis in the leaves, and the fungus isn't in the leaves, it's just a toxin. So that's one we might also see at the end of the season.
I love hearing you talk about the diseases. It's beautiful. Only a pathologist can see that.
Only a pathologist, and only in my research plots, right?
Oh, definitely. Every time you say that, I have to smile. Because what you see as beautiful is a potential yield robber for farmers.
It is a potential yield robber. Now, with sudden death syndrome, it does appear to be a big yield robber. However, it's usually found in association with cyst nematode. And that is the true yield robber. When we have these two, there's been all kinds of debate and all kinds of studies, but overall, if you've got soybean cyst nematode in your field, that's what you really need to focus on. Interestingly, that we're kind of moving in that direction. With soybean cyst nematode, we're now in the midst of raising awareness. The SCN Coalition is back, sponsored through the Chekhov funds, and really what we've been finding in several states is resistance to the 88.8, 788 is beginning to develop in the cyst populations. So we have over statewide about half of the cyst populations that we've collected and tested in the university labs at Ohio State, we're finding a slow adaptation where we are getting reproduction. It's not the same as a susceptible, but we are seeing an increase in reproduction on this resistance. So it's lasted for 20 years. It's the primary source of resistance, this PI that came from China, 88788. It's a multigenic resistance. So the fact that it's lasted this long is really wonderful. And so doing this survey now, finding out where our populations are high, and if they are high, how does that population respond to 8878 or another source of resistance, Peking? That's our goal to really get a handle on over the next year.
So you mentioned that there's a program available to help determine if SCN is a problem in your fields.
That's true. Right now, we have funding through Ohio Soybean Council, through the soybean checkoff, to actually go through and survey. So if farmers are members of the American Soybean Association, we've kind of gone through that group first. People, if they're not a member, but they still want to get sampled, just maybe we're going to do those folks in the next year, and we'll have the county educators help coordinate that. We've done a really pretty broad surveys with some work from Dr. Laura Lindsay and also Steve Coleman with the fertility. So we're going to try to hit fields in areas of the state that we've never hit before. So we really can do a good scientific assessment. And then after that, then it'll be the free-for-all, hopefully.
Excellent. I think that's a great opportunity to understand what's decreasing yields in some of our soybean fields. Mm-hmm. So now is a good time to get out and be checking to see for some of these symptoms. If someone is going to go out and scout, what sorts of things should they be looking at from both the disease perspective and perhaps SCN?
Okay. So at this time of year, especially if a farmer knows where his problems were, those fields that always give problems, sclerotinia is a good example, white mold. We're just started to flower, right? So the fungicides for sclerotinia on those historic fields were at that time of application. If the field is canopied and if that's a susceptible variety in that field. We've got cool nights, which actually are conducive to the little mushrooms, little apothecia shooting up spores on the flowers. So this is a good time to kind of take a look at that. Other things, we're keeping an eye out open for frog eye leaf spot, especially going through the flowering period, because those fungicide decisions need to be made for the R3 applications. Again, only on susceptible varieties, and pretty typically only on fields that have a continuous soybean history where the frog eye's been there. The inoculum's there, it's going to build up much faster. Cyst nematode, I would probably wait a little bit for cyst nematode. You can sample now for the soil. But with cyst, what I find is usually when the beans start getting taller, really start putting on the growth and filling out. If you're walking through a field and there's heavy cyst pressure, you'll be walking along and the beans will be waist high, and next thing you know, they're only knee high. And that's a good spot where we've probably got populations that are really causing some significant yield loss. So hopefully no one will find those, but those are the good ones. And you can actually take a shovel, pull them out. If you're on sandy soil, pull them out, and you'll actually be able to see the cyst on the roots.
So the cyst on the roots would be what you were looking for to say it wasn't necessarily an area that just had standing water?
Exactly. And it also, if you don't see the cyst on the roots and they are short, there might be another cause.
Okay.
So what would that be?
All right. So if we are scouting and we're seeing some of these issues in the field, are there any treatment options or things management-wise that we can do to lessen our yield impacts?
So you're not going to find things like sclerotinia, right at this point. Because the infections haven't occurred yet. So those things all have to be proactive. But if you're walking in the fields and you find frog eye, then scheduling that field for a frog eye fungicide, a fungicide that will affect frog eye at that R3 application. But for diseases, really, the crop plant should have resistance. I mean, resistance in soybeans, companies spend a lot of money on it, a lot of breeding. So really, there shouldn't be much you should have to do. So it's one thing that you can save money on additional inputs if you make that right, the best variety selection up front early on.
So if we find an issue this year, then the best way to manage that would be to make decisions in the future. Or would you say seed treatments or just?
So that's a good question. If stand loss has been a big issue this year and you're confident that it was from all these seedling blights, really go back and A, did you put a seed treatment on? And B, what was it? Did you leave out a couple ingredients that maybe you shouldn't have, or switch it up? If you do find a disease this year, most of these diseases, especially the foliar ones, will overwinter on the residue. So, or if you have high cyst populations, the next year in that field should be growing something different. Really getting back to really expanding our crop rotation would be, put me out of business almost, I wouldn't have anything to do. So that's one thing to think about. So crop rotation, and then if you do have a disease in the field, really go into and looking at choosing a different variety, because most of the things can be managed with host resistance.
Excellent. Well, Anne, we've covered a lot of information today. Is there somewhere our listeners can go to learn more about what you talked about?
One of the first resources that I post things to and discuss things on a weekly basis is the corn newsletter. So we get together. I hear from extension educators. I've heard from growers during the week, and my own tours around the state. So to try to summarize what the issues are, what we've been finding, what we've been hearing. So I found that really good. And with that are links to several of our different websites. So I have a u.osu.edu website that has all of our fact sheets. We've got a lot of pictures of the diseases so that people can kind of compare notes. We've also got our field book, our field crop disease book, which has got a lot of the pictures. So that's going to be forthcoming, the latest edition, but a lot of the same pictures are on the website in that book. The book is nice because you can just throw it in the truck and have it from there. And then we're always glad to get emails if people have questions.
All right. Well, we'll definitely include the links and your email in the description of the podcast so that you can click on those. And thank you so much for taking time out of this busy summer to talk to us.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.